Hello, Brian, and welcome back to Japan by River Cruise. I'm Bobby Judo.
And I'm Ollie Horn.
And joining us this week is Jason Mitchell, game developer, father of two, and author of the New York Times bestseller and alternative definitive ranking of the world's best river cruises. His number one pick, by the way, is a two-way tie between cruises on the Sumidagawa and the Nile. In his book, he writes, one of these is a majestic trip through one of the world's greatest civilizations, and the other is a smoggy way to get to Cairo. Jason, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, fellas.
On this week's show, Jason wanted to stop by to add his perspective to the bilingual parenting discussion, and in doing so, potentially save my children from a lifetime of English cram school. Plus, Ollie's got your weekly River Cruise recommendation. Ollie?
Yes, Bobby. Well, given that the oldest known repository of human wisdom, Yahoo Answers, is closing and deleting its archives next month, I decided to use it this week to crowdsource my recommendation. The responses I got ranged from, I went on an amazing cruise tour once. You got to it by taking a bus from the main train station in Tokyo. If you want more information, you can probably Google it. To, is this Yahoo email support? ? To, why go to Japan after what they did to us? I'll try them all later in the show.
Also, I'm coming to you remote this week from my 2-week trip on the Han River cruise ship in my fully private, one-family-only isolation boat. Jason has ranked this one as the worst trip in the world, but since everyone else around the globe is doing it, I figured I'd check it out. So far, I can confirm that it is financially, physically, and emotionally devastating. No more on that later, because my wife has asked me not to publicize the details online. Instead, soap talk. Brian, you've got kids, right?
Sure.
Is raising them to be bilingual or bicultural something that's important to you?
No.
Thank you, Brian. Jason, how old are your kids, and how are you guys handling the pandemic in the States?
Yeah, we've got a 9 and 5-year-old boy, and we've been handling it pretty well where we are. The younger one was still in daycare and kindergarten on site, so that helped a lot, whereas the older one has been doing remote schooling from home.
So you asked to come on. You reached out and got in contact with us after we did our episode about bilingual parenting. We talked to Dan Yoder about his experiences and how they compared to my own, as we're both trying to raise bilingual children in Japan. What was it about that episode, or about what we talk about on the podcast in general, that made you want to come on and get involved in this particular topic?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's super interesting to me. Obviously, it's a huge part of our identity, raising our kids in Japanese and in English. And it was an interesting discussion to hear you guys talk about your life in Japan with the same language mix, but obviously flipped the other way around, with the majority language being Japanese and minority being English where you live. And I just thought it would be interesting to compare notes and talk about different perspective with where the languages are.
Yeah, I mean, it's really something that you can't talk about enough. There are so many angles to explore with it. One of the angles that Ollie's most concerned about it in terms of languages with his child is what their internal monologue is going to be.
Yeah, I can't wait to get stuck in. Yeah, I got a few comments when I mentioned on Rochelle's episode that I can't imagine my cat speaking anything else than English. All I was trying to explain was, like, you know, I have this egocentric view of the world, and like cats speak English in my head because that's what I grew up with. Obviously, I appreciate they don't. Although I do now know that cats like do scream when they're horny, right? And there's definitely like a cat language for I've had my first period and I'm looking for a mate. Like now I now know what catcalling means, right? That didn't make sense to me before. And yeah, I mean I went to get the cat neutered. Is that the right word?
Neutered for a male, spayed for a female.
Spayed. Okay, that's what I got. And it really calmed her down. Before, she was up all night just screaming for a mate. I'm not sure how cats, like, it's a very optimistic thing, isn't it? I think that you can just scream loud enough and you'll find a mate. But maybe in the past
Isn't
it
that
worked for
basically
cats.
what you do with your stand-up?
yeah, not far off it. But this cat now is so well documented because obviously I plan to take it back to the UK eventually. It's got its own pet passport, as I think I've mentioned, and it's now got loads more documentation. Right, it's got like a certificate, almost like a birth certificate. I say it was born in Malaysia, right? And And like this cat is now so much better documented than I am in this country, where I am still essentially overstaying my visa. I worry that when I go to the airport, I'm going to have her do all the check-in procedures and me just be in a box going, "Can I come with you?" But all right, that's probably all the contribution I have towards a discussion on parenting.
Jason, we're just going to have to go ahead and pretend that pet ownership is the same as being a parent for us to be able to move on with this conversation.
Well, that is.
Yeah, pro tip, Ollie. Parents don't love that.
Well, that.
Parents of humans don't love that.
Well, maybe one day when you own a cat, you'll understand. It's all a matter of perspective. Bobby, do we have anybody to thank this week?
Yes, somebody bought us a coffee on buymeacoffee.com/Japan by River Cruise. Kumiko bought us a coffee. Kumiko-san, thank you very much.
Thank you. Was that accompanied by any feedback or advice, or this one was just
No, it was just a pure gift.
a good old-fashioned, here's some coffee money? Well, thank you very much, Kumiko. Also, we probably should mention that we're going to be announcing our next sticker pack this week. We now have 3 new trendy designs, and they should be winging their way to our distribution center in Fukuoka.
That's me.
That's Bobby right there. And so if you missed out on the sticker bandwagon last time and you want to get involved, then check out our Twitter at JBRCPod, where we will post all of the details.
Also, if we're doing merch announcements, I'm sitting on magnets.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, we could do a whole sticker and magnet set if anybody would like.
Let's do that. We will, yeah. I also half thought about doing T-shirts, but I realised what an absolute ball ache it's going to be to ship them out from Malaysia. So we'll hold that thought.
Yeah, but it would be a great time for people to buy some merchandise, if only because this 2-week trip that I'm on, this vacation, is putting a significant dent in my my earning prospects.
Shall we jump into the news?
The Japan Times reports, school is out in much of the world, but Japanese teachers are happy to return. Does this have anything to do with the increase in Japanese teachers who want to die? Our correspondents have followed up.
Yes, but this week there's no time to cover submissions from @Wes in Japan and @My2Yen, since later in the show I'll be reading my 4,000-word investigative journalism piece on why Japan's teachers found it harder to replicate the Japanese classroom experience on Zoom, asking whether it's to do with the fact that when you have a laptop on your desk, there's nowhere to put your head to nap.
If you'd like to join the JBRC Press Club, please follow us on Twitter at JBRCPod for next week's assignment.
So, Jason, you and Bobby wanted to talk about bilingual parenting again. Why is it so difficult that it needs 2 whole episodes dedicated to it?
I think Bobby's just interested in talking to some other folks, maybe.
That is why we started inviting guests on, is we got tired of talking to each other about the same things over and over again.
So basically, it's just Bobby was looking for topics to somehow ostracize me. This is episode 80 on health food.
We did get into it with Dan Yoder in a past episode, but there were a lot of things that even in that discussion that I felt like we didn't broach. And when Jason reached out to us, he brought up some of the main ones that I couldn't believe that we'd forgotten to talk about, including why we feel like it's important to have our children grow up bilingual. And I think I just kind of took it for granted. You know, it was if we're going to do it bilingually, it was atarimai. It was just something that I was taking for granted that, you know, I speak English, their mom speaks Japanese. They should grow up with both. But what are the reasons? What are the motivations for why we're doing what we're doing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, because obviously living where we live in the U.S., it's not the norm to do that. At least, maybe not anymore. I mean, maybe once upon a time that was more normal for folks to try and preserve their heritage languages for longer after immigrating to the U.S. But I guess for me, it's really a way to hopefully give the kids access to simply more of the world, and also just help them be more empathetic people. I mean, I think building one's empathy is kind of a lifelong process, and helping them do that from an early age by, you know, having a wider perspective than just being just American kids, basically.
I think it's probably important to note that for some generations of immigrants in particularly America, but also other countries, the idea that you could grow up bilingually was a privilege. That, you know, certainly if you think about the Japanese experience in America, there was obviously a huge reason to not preserve your Japanese language, and obviously, you know, I speak to quite a few people who regret the fact that they don't speak their mother's native language or their grandmother's native language. But the reason why it wasn't passed on was because it would. The thinking at the time was it might hold them back in society. It might prevent integration.
It's a good point, Ollie. We definitely are. I guess I'm definitely coming from a bit of a position of privilege to be able to sort of make this choice and feel confident that even though our kids are sort of clawing back part of their heritage, basically, that they won't be ostracized for that, or it won't impact them negatively, which probably isn't true for everyone.
There definitely are immigrant parents into English-speaking countries that purposely don't teach their kids their heritage language because they want them to assimilate. They want them to fit in and to be seen as American or English or what have you. And I think it was really interesting that just the idea of, well, why do we want to teach them the minority language never occurred to me as a native English speaker. And Ali, you may have actually raised a good point talking about how ethnocentric it is to assume that your cat's internal monologue is English.
Very good point.
Because for me, when English is the minority language, it didn't even occur to me to go, well, why is it necessary? It's just, well, it's necessary. But somebody in that situation, a Vietnamese person moving to America might go, well, what is the point? If we're going to be in America, we should speak only English.
Well, probably to hypercorrect those do-gooders who go, actually, it's pronounced pho.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess for us, I guess it's just kind of a personal thing. I was super disappointed, growing up in a very monolingual part of the U.S. When I was young, having zero access to foreign language until high school, when it was basically just a subject, which was a peer to math or science or anything else. When it's really hard to start learning at that age, for one thing, and then we kind of found ourselves. So my wife is Japanese and Taiwanese American. She grew up. So her parents spoke a common language of English, which meant that the kids pretty much grew up speaking English at home, despite having access to those two other cultures through their immigrant parents.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's another reason why some immigrants end up not really hanging on to their heritage language, is if they through intermarriage, they have to kind of run the household in another language maybe. But we were in a lucky position to try and counteract so that experience that I had as a kid with access to my in-laws, in particular my mother-in-law, who's Japanese. We happened to live near her. We happen to live in a community with a pretty large Japanese population, and access to resources like preschools and activities and things like that we were able to leverage those resources to help us out, because our Japanese is not good enough for us to go and try and raise these kids to speak Japanese, say it on our own. So if we lived in a different place, this wouldn't be possible.
Right. So what's the overall goal with raising a bilingual child?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, professionally, I've kind of met these, superhumans that are able to sort of flow between different cultures and different languages and be near fluent in multiple different ones. And I think that gives them access to sort of more of the world, maybe a better career path potentially. And I think that's an interesting thing to want for your kids. But I think ultimately, really, for me, it comes back to the empathy thing. If you've been the person that is operating maybe in not your native language, and you're trying to communicate with people outside of where you've grown up, you gain I think a better understanding and empathy for then other people that are in that position, that when the tables are turned and so on.
Let's go ahead and play a little bit of devil's advocate with ourselves here, because I'm sure we've both had this experience, me in Japan and you in the States, of people saying that we shouldn't raise our kids bilingually. You hear this opinion that you shouldn't try to teach a kid two languages at once at the same time when they're younger. What's the idea behind that?
I think that's a misconception. I've never bought into that, and I've got actually very little of that, to be perfectly honest. I think I've probably seen more of that in terms of reading online, other people talking about raising bilingual kids, than actually facing it in person myself.
Are there any effects in terms of what languages learn first, or trying to learn them at the same time?
I'm sure in the academic literature you can find things like that. We definitely, mean, for us, there definitely was some opportunity cost with our older son. So our basic policy was to speak only Japanese with the kids until they were 5 years old. We switched over a little earlier on the second kid just because his brother was around, and he was hearing English sooner, and he is sort of bilingual sooner.
Right.
But so with our older son, his English when we sort of started it when he was in kindergarten, it was a little weird, and I'm pretty sure that it it kept him out of the gifted track at his elementary school. He totally aced the math and missed the verbal by a small margin, and we were like, come on, he could do this in 2 languages. What are you doing? Give him a pass, but it didn't work out. So there's some opportunity cost that comes from that. But I personally haven't seen, a lot of downsides in terms of, cognitive ability or anything like that.
There just can't be examples, can there, where like the kid never learns either language, right? Has anyone ever met that when just because parents have thrust so many languages on their kid, there's no mother tongue?
I've heard from a Japanese friend that one of the issues with Japanese families sending their kids to international schools in Japan is that the schools in Japan don't teach Kokugo. They don't teach the Japanese mother language. So you've got these kids in elementary school and middle school who aren't learning kanji or to read and write in Japanese. And then they're speaking all English at school. But they go home and the home environment doesn't back up the English language. So what you end up is with a kid who speaks fair but not great English and can't read or write Japanese.
Yeah, that's tricky with Japanese in particular, since it's just objectively so much work to take on kanji in particular.
Right.
That if you're simply missing that, you're not going to really pick that up passively like you do.
Well, there probably are languages where it's preferable to start earlier. Like I know it's better for any language to just start when you're younger, but I certainly think with the likes of Chinese or Japanese, where you have to essentially motor memory these patterns, right? It's just way harder for it to stick when you're an adult, and I just think you have less time and less staying power. I wonder whether of the two, like it's better to have the Japanese writing down by the time you're 10, because it's not by the time you're 10 you maybe haven't learned all the characters, but you've built up that muscle memory, that stroke order is now intuitive. Whereas in English, I think it's the pronunciation which becomes intuitive, right? And like Bobby, your kids, when they speak English, there's a sense that they are Japanese people speaking English rather than people who are, native English speakers.
That's because they're very uncomfortable talking to you. It's not when they talk to me. I mean, their V's and their THs are on point.
Oh,
man.
nice. Nice.
Okay.
And it's not just you. I've noticed this is again something that, Ali, if God forbid you ever become a parent, you'll discover. People who aren't your kids' parents don't understand how to talk to them. Jason, I don't know if you've noticed this, but like you'll notice like people who've never met your kids before who don't know them, their go-to mode is to talk to them at a level that's much, much lower than what they can do. And the kids respond to that. Like when somebody like that they don't know shows up and starts talking to them in a way that they register as a weird way to talk to them,
right,
they withdraw.
You mean just kind of code switching down to like an imagined kid level, or
Yeah.
Right.
I just talk to them how Bobby talks to me.
Nice. Yeah, I guess it's hard for me it's definitely hard for me to measure whether people maybe code switch down to a lower level for them in Japanese, just because I it would be too subtle for me to pick up on.
Yeah.
One thing that definitely that's related to that I've seen, which is pretty amusing, is when my older son, his first year in Hoshuko, I got to be which is the Japanese supplementary school that they attend here in the U.S.
Oh, they attend a supplementary school?
That's correct. Yes. So in the U.S., so Hoshuko generally is a network of supplementary schools that the actual Japanese Ministry of Education maintains overseas. There's about 200 different ones around the world, many in the U.S. And typically, it's a Saturday school that the kids attend. And it's designed specifically for Japanese families who may be stationed overseas for a work assignment for a number of years. And so the kids can keep up with the curriculum back home so that they can more easily reintegrate when the family returns.
Yeah.
But over the years, the Hoshuko has come to serve more than just the Japanese nationals that are overseas, but also, maybe families that are in marriages with one Japanese parent that are living in the U.S., or even sort of further down the chain in terms of, Nisei and Nisei's children, like which our kids would be, our Sansei.
Right.
And
Second or third generation. Yeah.
Correct, right. So the immigrant in Japanese, the actual immigrant generation is referred to as Issei. Their kids are Nisei and Sansei and on down the line, numbered like that. So anyway, the Hoshuko has come to serve sort of a larger population, including folks like us that may never end up living in Japan. And so anyway, so it relies a lot on parent volunteering, just because it's hard to staff a school like that with real full-time folks. They do actually send over, like the principals and some of the upper administrators actually do come over from Japan on like 3-year stints to run the schools. It's very official. They use the same textbooks, and they're right in step with the Japanese curriculum. Actually,
they make them sign a declaration that their hair color is their natural color.
Well, I assure you, the hair colors here are much more brown than in Japan. Naturally, just given the mixed race, the number of mixed race kids that are here.
Talking about the demographic of parents, there are the kind of parents who like regret that they never learnt guitar, so they force their kids to learn guitar. Are there any
guitar arrives
people
tomorrow.
who have? Are there any parents which have absolutely no nexus to Japan at all, but like they couldn't? They tried to learn N1 themselves. They were a big Japan fanatic and are now living their Japanese life vicariously through their children.
I guess I'm probably the closest one to that. But that hits a little close to home. But obviously here in our family, we do have a real connection to Japan with my wife and my mother-in-law. But so Hoshuko, being, obviously they need to maintain a pretty high standard. I mean, they are, kind of required actually by law to educate Japanese kids. This actually falls kind of under the actual Japanese constitution to provide education for the kids even when they're overseas, it turns out. And so they clearly need to maintain a high standard. And in fact, there are interviews to get in. So our son had like a one-on-one interview. They had like a 4 kids and 1 teacher interview, and then there was a parent interview as well. So, myself, my wife, and my mother-in-law went in and,
in Japanese.
Oh yeah, all in Japanese. With this, at the time, I didn't realize he was the actual head of the school at the time, which was probably good. So I wasn't intimidated. He was just a really nice Japanese guy to me at the time. But definitely a bunch of his questions were around, motivation and, wow. are you going to follow through with this? Like because you guys have to do a lot of the work as well. So we had to convince him that we were pretty serious about it in that way.
And just to go back to the anecdote that we were in the middle of that started all of this off, what was the incident with the Hoshuko, the supplementary school?
Right. Well, there's many, but the one that I was referring to was about sort of the code switching and talking to kids in particular. And I was in the classroom quite a bit, or quite a few times as a class photographer. Whenever they would have a guest or sort of a special event, we would be there to take pictures of it for the school yearbook and things like that. And I was feeling pretty good. I was following along. My listening seemed pretty good. I mean, all that terrace house seemed to be paying off, and with my listening comprehension was right there. And for one of the events, a lot of other parents came as well. And, the teacher was addressing the children, and I was following everything perfectly. And she pivoted 90 degrees and code switched to Japanese parent mode, and I was gone. I was getting 2% of what was coming. I was like, oh, boy.
So you were picking up with the elementary school level.
Oh, yes. It was too subtle for me to really appreciate the difference until that happened. It was just this discrete switch, and I was just totally slammed.
Well, let's talk a little bit about switching languages in general and this idea of cultural elements in switching languages. Do you feel that there really are, as we kind of talked about in the Dan episode, cultural elements that are embedded in a language? When you learn a language, you learn elements of the culture along with it.
Yeah, for sure. Like certainly the material. If you look at the Kokugo textbooks, they lean heavily into things that are like particularly Japanese.
Mm.
There'll be a lot of things about fables, a lot of things about maybe make the process of making, or all the things you can make out of soybeans. From tofu to soy sauce to the list goes on and on
Yeah.
for soy, of course. And there's so many things like that. Even in my youngest son's like hiragana book, it seems like they really try specifically, like for the character sa.
Right.
They're like, okay, what word is like super specific to Japanese that we can make? And so I learned a new word just the other day looking at his hiragana book, sasabune. Sasabune. Do you know what that is?
We know what a bune is.
Yeah, right. So, but sasabune, I couldn't actually tell from the drawing what it was. I had to look it up and see some YouTube videos. It's a particular little toy boat made out of bamboo leaves.
Ha, 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 ha.
So it'd be the kind of thing that like a Japanese person just would know.
Yeah.
They would have grown up. Grandpa would have made them for them and put them in the little stream or whatever. And we just you just don't know that.
Dude, our listeners know this.
And they definitely Japanese lean heavily into seasonality, things that are particular to different seasons, and there's a lot of sort of built-in knowledge as to what's seasonal.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've even had my sons have even had homework about like match the season to the thing, like which bug or which fruit or which fish is in season then, things like that.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of the downsides of being bilingual. I have a real concern that kind of forcing bilingualism on my kids too much could essentially culturally alienate them down the road. And I'm curious, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, living in America, especially with kind of the anti-Asian hate crimes on the rise, if you have any concerns about teaching your kids Japanese.
Yeah, that's definitely much more recently on my mind. That particular downside, obviously, given the trends in the U.S. We happen to live in a community where it's actually extremely normal for families to speak other languages, and there's a large Asian population here. Honestly, it's sometimes it feels like on the playground the white kids are the minority, and then the half kids from various different mixes are the majority. Right. I know I chaperoned an event at my son's elementary school, and this is just the regular public elementary school, and there were two languages being spoken on the bus, English and Japanese. That just so happened that there was like 8 Japanese kids on that bus, and they would switch into it. One of them spoke to me in Japanese, and another kid was like, "Why did you speak to him in Japanese?" There were enough kids that they didn't even all know me, kind of thing, right? Like, "Why did you speak to that guy in Japanese?" Like, "No, he speaks Japanese." Anyway, it's just it's just much more normal here, is what it comes down to.
Is that's just a product of your particular geography?
Yeah, it is. It is. So it's definitely not the same everywhere. And so I guess I'm somewhat concerned maybe in the long term that there could be some negativity toward it, but I really don't think so. It's not going to affect my decision to invest in this for our family.
Yeah.
So all this sounds like pretty hard work. How will you know when to stop?
It's a really good question. I definitely ask myself often like what success looks like in this case, and I think if I think back to the beginning, I don't even know if I would have imagined us getting this far, to be perfectly honest, in terms of the kids being this successful with their bilingual education. And so we're just going to keep pushing. Our oldest is entering 4th grade in Japanese school. The Japanese school year is just starting this week, so they'll be starting their first day of Hoshuko in the new grade on Saturday. And a lot of kids wash out at the end of middle school, so a few more years to go. Yeah. It's a huge trade-off, right? You give up all your Saturdays, and it's tough to make that last.
Yeah. I think a lot recently about what my goals are in having my kids become bilingual and wanting them to be fluent in both. And when they were a little bit younger, I think my had a resistance to this idea of, the father says something in English and the kid answers in Japanese. And you have, even though communication is successful, it would feel like to me that I wasn't being successful in my parenting goals. But as they get older, I'm realizing that, 10 years, 20 years down the line, if I say something in any language and they respond, I'll consider that a success.
Hey, thanks very much for listening to this, episode 79 of Japan by River Cruise. Thank you very much to everyone that buys us a coffee. It's the only way the show is supported, and we genuinely appreciate it.
Also have merchandise available from this week, and we'd like to say thank you to our guest, Jason Mitchell. It was glad to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you very much. If folks want to find out more, they can follow me on Twitter at Nihongodomo, and I also blog at Nihongodomo.com about this sort of thing.
Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next week.